Hello, I'm Mark Kermode. Welcome to this audio commentary for Elephant.
Hello, I'm Danny Boyle, the producer of the film.
Danny, tell us something about your background with Alan Clarke and how you became involved in Elephant.
Well, I'd been working in the theatre, in the Royal Court Theatre, and I wanted to get involved in films, but I wrote to lots of people and couldn't get a job, so I tried to get into television, and I got a job in Belfast. Basically because nobody else wanted a job. I think they made me a producer there. And I then wrote to Alan Clarke, who was my favourite director that I recognised from the television, and asked to his advice and help. And he was brilliant. He wrote back and said, come out and watch him filming. And I went out to see him on set for a film called Christine, which is a very weird forerunner of Elephant, really, in terms of technique, certainly. Then when I went to do the job, I asked him to come and make a film in Northern Ireland for me or with me, and we'd do it together, really. And he was, as always with Alan, the more bizarre the idea, the more difficult the concepts, the more interested he was, you know. So, he came over and we started to develop the idea which ended up as Elephant.
How did your sort of admiration for Alan Clarke originally go? Because obviously to a whole generation of British filmmakers, he's the man. But for those who perhaps aren't quite so familiar with his work, what was it about him that made him so important to you?
It's very, very difficult to say exactly, because you admire lots of directors, but there's always something special about someone, and for him it was me. I have it about him and Nick Rogue, and you can talk technically about the way that they work and the way that their films look. I think it's something a bit deeper than that somehow, you know. You just feel drawn to them and to the way they show the world, really. I'd seen this film, very, very weird film called Penda's Fen, which is a film he'd made for television, and just in the way you're drawn to it, I just thought it was a unique way of presenting the world, really. And obviously, although I had no idea whether the stuff I do is like his stuff in any respect, but for some reason you recognise something in it that you just long to be like. You don't try and copy it slavishly, but you long for something in the people, in your idols, really, and he's one of my idols.
There's also some sense of him on a personal level being an extraordinary person, because everyone who talks about him very, very fondly, as if he was a mentor and a very inspirational figure, and you seem to have the same feeling about him.
Oh yeah, he was. I remember when he shortly before he died, you know, he was in this hospice, really, in Archway, and went to see him there, and he was mad about football and about all the things that working class people are crazy about, basically. And but all he was interested in now at the end there was feeding these birds on his window ledge, and I was kind of torn apart by it, really, to see him like that. And it's very difficult. I think the affection that you'll find, like you say, that everybody feels for him is a testament to how he behaved to everybody. And something I learnt from him is he treated everybody the same. It didn't matter whether you were famous or whether you were just, serving him the tea or whatever. He treated everybody the same. And if you can do that, it makes you worth respecting, I think.
And tell us something about how the format of Elephant worked out, because obviously what you have is, at the beginning, a series of very deliberately repetitious killings in which you see somebody walking, you see a victim, you see a very fast assassination, then you have a shot of the victim afterwards. And this repeats itself in a way which is very disorientating originally for the audience. Tell us how this idea came about. I mean, you don't have a script, you appear to have a graph.
Yeah, we didn't have a script. What happened is I'd already been working for about 18 months in Northern Ireland, and I still lived in London, and I used to fly backward and forward to Belfast. I had lots of friends in Belfast, and what it was based on was this unease, this difference between the way the public in London and the UK without Northern Ireland perceived the Troubles at that point, which was the mid-80s. And basically what was happening is that there was very little interest, other than in enormous events like Inniskilling, which happened at the time. There was very little interest in what I could see was going on day to day in Northern Ireland, which was a relentless series of civilian deaths, executions, basically, like you see. Sure. And the Northern Ireland Press Office at the BBC issued this list, which became really the script of the film, which was a description broken down into categories of who died each year. And it was the way that when the Troubles first began, there was a lot of army, or you see UDR personnel killed. And then basically as they were withdrawn, and there were less deaths there amongst those kind of what you would call targets, really. But the civilian deaths continued at an alarming rate, and it drew me to thinking about why people didn't know about these deaths. And so we decided to make a film that tried to show that, really, and tried to show in a way that wasn't, in a traditional drama, wasn't moralistic. You know, it didn't have a conclusion, it didn't have any redemption, it didn't have the normal techniques of drama, to find a different way of describing it outside the bounds of drama. The intention was not to show the film in Northern Ireland, because everybody was aware. People lived with this day in, day out. They were very conscious of it. Unfortunately, it went out in Northern Ireland as well as the rest of the UK, and it upset people there, because they didn't need to see this kind of film. It was more for the mainland, and the way that our relationship with the press and what the press had chosen to show us of Northern Ireland had actually kind of immunised us to what was actually going on there.
Well, tell us something about, for example, how the shots were set up, because the extraordinary thing about it is, at the beginning, I mean, visually it's absolutely beautiful, this strange, wide-angle lens tracking, following a character you haven't met before. You meet somebody else. There's a very sort of passionless execution, shocking because of the fact that there appears to be no emotion involved in it, followed by another and another. It has an extraordinary visual style, but tell us how, for example, you would set something like this up. I mean, it can't have been scripted as the camera follows a man walking into a room and an execution happens. How did it actually progress?
We talked about different scenarios, some of which would be based on realism.
Okay.
For instance, people bursting into houses and chasing somebody and executing them. But also Alan freely invented more mythical scenarios, really. It's really interesting watching it again. I watched it last night before doing this with you, and it's really interesting watching all these empty spaces. Of course, this film was made at the height of Margaret Thatcher's dismantling of the kind of normal work, the normal jobs of people, really, particularly somewhere like Northern Ireland. And it's amazing watching the film how much that reads now, where you realise these empty, desolate, and like you say, very beautiful sometimes, industrial or office spaces where nobody appears to be working. The only people who appear to be working are people in petrol stations, serving petrol. That was really interesting. I think the emphasis on walking, towards the second half of the film it becomes about cars, but the emphasis on walking was something that I found really interesting looking back at it again, because the walk is a very, very powerful symbol in Northern Ireland. The marching, is and suddenly you pick on these individual people who are marching through on their way. I think he obviously wanted to suggest that these people were bound together by more than just a task. They were bound together by something historical and something almost tragically inevitable, really, in a way, in the way that they seek each other out. And it's interesting the way that the only thing that really develops in the film is that occasionally you see recognition between people before death, really. And it's almost like they recognise that what is going to happen to them, and they knew it was going to happen. Even though we've followed the killer in, the victim knew it was going to happen as well.
But there's an interesting thing, you said the word mythical. As far as the environment of it is concerned, with these great big open empty spaces, if you see the film completely cold now, for example, not knowing about the background of it, it is possible to watch 5 or 10 minutes of it without realising where it's set at all. It could be set absolutely anywhere in a kind of mythical landscape. In fact, it's not until on the football pitch when somebody finally says something and you recognise an accent that it's absolutely located, as where it is. I mean, I wonder whether that mythical, more general thing about revenge, obviously the title itself is Elephant Never Forgets, presumably.
No, it's not actually.
Okay.
Although you can certainly, I think probably the majority of people read it like that.
Okay.
We didn't put up there was a kind of subtitle that was meant to go up with it, which we left off in the end, which is a very famous phrase, which refers to the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and it's I believe written by Bernard MacLaverty, and it says it's a simple phrase. It just says the elephant in our living room, and the reference is that nobody refers to it, even though obviously in your living room it is an enormous presence and something that you cannot avoid. That was where the title originally came from.
So as far as you were concerned, is it absolutely specific to the area. It's absolutely specific to the Troubles. It's not, more mythical, more general tale of, ongoing revenge and killing, because I think it is possible to see it in a way which is less specific.
I think it's a tribute to Alan, that really. I mean, wherever he would photograph, for instance, the film I spoke about that I watched him making, Christine, which was set on a really boring housing estate, so uninteresting looking visually, he made look cinematic and mythical. He's somebody who could just transform Britain somehow into something worthy of watching in a cinema. You didn't think you were watching a small piece of television about, a parochial subject. I can't see it in any other way other than being about Northern Ireland, because I was there for 3 years, and I can't see it in any other way. But it's wonderful that it does read like that, Some of it is specific, accurate. Some of it is deliberately, I think, by Alan, very inaccurate in terms of how people were killed. There's a couple of very, very weird ones that are actually not anything that I recognise what happened there. And I admire him for that, because I think that it's ways like that he pulled it out and made it possible to read it in ways outside its time or its location.
Tell us something about the casting, because it's an interesting collection of faces, specifically people who have been chosen who don't look like killers. They look like, a cross-section of people from a range of social backgrounds and a range of environments. Tell us a little bit about that.
That was just one of the ideas, really, that it could be anybody. And when you were living in Northern Ireland, it was extraordinary the way that the conflict has grips people. And people that are very... I remember telling Alan how... I'd spent a lot longer there than Alan, and I remember telling him my reaction to being so surprised that sometimes very middle-class people who you would expect to be thinking outside the conflict were actually just, as much as anybody else, were just absolutely locked inside it in terms of attitude and opinion. And that really, I remember a couple of occasions being really shocked by things that people said, and you expected them to have a kind of middle class refinement, a irony, a distance, something about the conflict, but they didn't. They were locked into it like so many people, really.
Just on a technical level, tell us something about these endless walking shots, which are absolutely beautiful. They're filmed on it's a wide angle lens, presumably, and is it done with a Steadicam or what? These are long shots.
Yeah, he worked with a cameraman called John Ward, who was an extraordinary Steadicam operator who'd worked with Kubrick and people like that. And I think he shot virtually everything on the Steadicam. He would lock on this wide angle lens, which I personally, it's something technically I've borrowed for the work for films that I've made, and it gives you this absolute lonely beauty for an individual walking, and yet when they get close to camera, suddenly you're sucked into it's almost like you're sucked into the event as well. Just as they pass you, you're lured in like down a drain. You're whipped into it as well. It's a brilliant dynamic piece of equipment, and it's true for a piece of cinema. You should use the landscape and let people breathe and see, and let them make their own decisions about what they look at. They can look at the man walking, or they can look elsewhere and start to look. They can get bored by the man walking. That's fine, and just start to look elsewhere and select other things to look at.
This is probably one of the first moments when it seems to be very specifically about Northern Ireland, because everyone was aware of the news stories of the doorstep killings and that sort of thing. Tell us a little bit about when you were actually filming it on location, what kind of reaction you got from people, because it's a raw subject and it's a violent piece of work. How did people react when you were actually making the thing?
It was difficult, really, because most hardcore dramas about Northern Ireland are not made in Northern Ireland. They tend to be made in Leeds and Manchester. Yeah. And I'm very proud of the fact that we made the film there. The word difficult is you are trampling on people's grief sometimes. Not trampling deliberately, but it's just your sheer presence and what you're doing and is insensitive to their grief sometimes. But I'm very proud of the fact that he made it there, because I think he didn't have to deal with any of the issues of matching or believability in any of the other places. He could just soak up what inspired him in being in Northern Ireland.
And what about the violence of the killings? I mean, they're shot in a very, very blank way. To some extent, kind of reminds you of Krzysztof Kieslowski's short film about killing. It's absolutely without emotion. It's functional and therefore horrible. How was that arrived at?
He just doesn't blink, Alan, in any of his work. I think that's one of the things that pinpoints him, picks him out as an individual filmmaker. He doesn't blink, really. He's not interested in blinking. There's an extraordinary sequence later where two men approach a man outside a factory, and one runs and shoots him, and the other man walks slowly towards him.
Yes.
And I remember when he shot that I found that I remember at the time, and it's partly my shallowness, I think, I remember thinking how excitingly shot it was. Now I find it, when I watched it, I found it almost unbearable to watch, really. And that's what he was interested in, I think. He's taking you to that place where you found things unbearable.
Tell us about this scene, because this is very interesting. It's the first scene in which there is some the only scene in which there's verbal interaction, but there's this very peculiar sense that these guys start playing football with each other before the awful killing happens, and it's very powerful. Tell me about what's going on.
One of the things you can't avoid in Northern Ireland, apart from the fact that it's a wonderful place, people are so friendly. It is a small community of actually wonderful, wonderful, warm people. Obviously, there are two tribes, in a sense. And depending on your political perspective of it, they are tribes, or it is a class conflict, or whatever you call it. But they are bound together in a greater whole, as well as being divided by those lines, really. And obviously he suggested it in the film by you not knowing quite where the killer would come from here, and that these people, in a way, almost wouldn't know themselves either, perhaps, you know. That's not that realistic, I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
I think, but again,
not realistic because
I think, to be honest, people there would know, in a purely realistic sense, they would know whether somebody was trustable or not, trustworthy or not.
Okay.
But I think he deliberately makes some of those details unconvincing so that you don't know where you are. I think he wants the viewer to not know where you are in terms of what's going to happen, particularly with something repetitive like that. It's a drama technique, but it's also because he doesn't want you to be able to predict or indeed feel that you have a grip on the situation, like you know what's going to happen, therefore you feel some kind of understanding of it. He wanted to take you beyond that, I think.
And what about the actual the mechanics of the killings themselves? I'm talking about this on a technical level. They appear to be very brutal, largely because they're not glorious. They're very fast, they're very sudden, and they're execution killings. And yet the way in which they're technically handled makes you really believe that you are seeing something incredibly brilliant. By 20 minutes into the film, you're really ground down by it. Now, how hard was that to achieve? I mean, people may think it's a fairly simple thing to film what appears to be a genuine execution.
Very difficult. Most, as you'll see, there's very few of them that he cuts away from the deaths. It's very difficult to do convincing deaths, really. A lot of the actors were not big-time actors. There's a few big-time actors in it, but most of them were really people who did extra work. They were kind of walk-on supporting artists, lots of them, or small part players. And yet somehow, because he's a brilliant director, he makes everybody feel like they're in the same film, despite their different techniques and standards, and he also manages to make them convincing in the way that they die. There's a couple where you can see him cut away because it's probably slightly less convincing, but it's amazing how convincing some of them are. And he's doing it all without trip wires and the things that you use now, you know, to pull people away and make them look like they've been blown away or things like that. He just lets them drop, you know. He obviously briefed them on how he wanted it to feel, and then they went for it, really.
This is particularly shocking because it's just the complete insane casualness of he's in a garage, he comes out, you know, and then we do exactly as we've done every time, is we then look and see the corpse lying dead on the floor. Tell us about that technique of showing us the body for a long held shot afterwards.
Well, I think that he wants you to feel like you should be witness to that, whereas what was going on in the news at the time is that these killings were happening, and the deaths were, each year in the 80s there was anything between 35 and 57 deaths, civilian deaths like that, and you weren't hearing about them. I would come back to London at the weekend to see my kids, and you just didn't know anything about these deaths, and yet you were in Northern Ireland, you were hearing about them all the time. And yet an event like the Michael Ryan slaughter, I think, of 11 people, was massive news in Britain, dominated the news, and yet there were 4 or 5 times that number of people being killed, civilians being killed in Northern Ireland, and it was going almost unreported in the rest of the UK.
And what about the construction of those shots, the shots afterwards of the dead bodies? It seemed to me to look as if they had been based on newspaper photographs in the same way like VG used to photograph dead bodies. The bodies seem to fall in ways which you imagine is exactly what you would see on a newsreel or something.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is based on eyewitness accounts of. There aren't any witnesses in Northern Ireland to these killings for all sorts of reasons, and in fact, that is one of the things there's almost no witnesses throughout the film. There are occasional witnesses. They always run away if there are any witnesses to it, but otherwise they're on, and that was deliberate, that you do not have any witnesses around for it.
No, but what you have is after the fact, when you see the bodies, you imagine that is how the bodies are then found.
Yes.
And that's why I sort of refer to Ouija. It's the finding the things after the fact.
Yeah, and they were based on police evidence, really, of what they found because obviously they're the people who turn up. There were some deeply distressing ones which we never covered, which were to do with children who were left in the house with their dead parent or dead relative, and the police going in and finding these children.
I mean, this tableau, for example, this is classic in that it's not cinematic. It's not a movie death. It looks like what you imagine a genuine event would look like afterwards. It's not glorious or exciting. It's just terrible.
Yeah, it's not touched up, is it? No, but it is about staring at something like that, and it's almost like when you see a corpse. I know when I've seen a corpse, you feel like you're frozen. I mean, maybe you're not, but you feel like you're frozen in time watching them. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to do that, I think, with it.
The geography here interesting as well, because we're going through the entire social strata. We've gone through, as you say, garages and industrial warehouses, and then suddenly we're in this lawn. I mean, the implication of the geography seems to be it goes all the way through all the social strata.
Yeah, I think we call this one, although we call this the Judge, I think, this particular one. Yes, exactly, that it does go right the way through, and that was something that I talked to Alan a lot about the way that it seeped through all the areas of society. I think when I went to Northern Ireland, I believed very much a kind of a Marxist position on it, really, that it was a class issue. Mm-hmm. I have to say, when I came away from there, I didn't believe that any longer. I believed it was something that was present in all stratas of society there, and something deep and very difficult. And I should say also, I think that the film offers no hope whatsoever, really. And I do think ultimately that's wrong. I think I've changed my mind about it, actually, because in such terrible circumstances, people have made progress. Some really brave politicians in the last 10 years, mm-hmm. and 10 years and longer, have actually made some progress there. And you have to take your hat off to them, because I have to say, as people looking at it at the time, we couldn't see any way that there was any hope of digging anything out. But some very, very brilliant politicians have managed to dig a bit of hope out of the situation and improve things, definitely.
I mean, it is a grinding and hopeless watch, although at the same time sort of tempered by the beauty of it, because it is a very visually beautiful film. But I wonder whether, if the situation has now changed, whether that, referring back to something I said earlier, whether the sort of the more general and mythical status of the story starts to kick in a little bit more, if it's no longer specifically about. I mean, do you think this still currently reflects the situation?
Not specifically, no. It's changed a lot, really, a great deal. And this kind of, basically what was called tit-for-tat killing, mm-hmm. This kind of body count on opposing sides has certainly declined a lot, yeah.
So in that case, the film is left to stand on its own dramatic merit, and I think it is still relevant today, even though that situation has changed.
Yeah, very much so. I think that's why you I'm not taking any credit for it, but that's why you get a great filmmaker to make a subject like this, because he can make it live for longer than it's the moment that it's relevant for, if you like, specifically. And it is mesmerising, and it certainly inspired Gus Van Sant, who asked me permission to use the title for the film that he won the Palme d'Or with in Cannes this year. And Alan would have loved that. Alan was generous with everything, really. He had there was no fallback position with Alan ever.
And what kind of size of crew are you working on for this? Because, I mean, obviously it's a stripped-down drama, empty spaces, camera. I mean, how big was the crew that would be out doing each one of these?
Quite small, really. I can't remember the specific numbers, but certainly compared to a film crew, very, very small. Okay. We had a very good...
You're talking 10 or 15 people as opposed to...
Yeah. We had... You'll see the list of them at the end. We had some wonderful people working out there. And it's a tribute to them that they made the film, both that a guy called Arwell Ellis Owen, who was the controller of... He was the head of the BBC there at the time. This is a very brave film for him to permit in the circumstances. And the crew, all of whom come from different backgrounds and would have very, very different opinions about what was being made here. They all worked tirelessly for Alan, and they all came up to his standard as well, because when you bring in somebody like Alan, he's, you know, a world-class filmmaker, to quite kind of inexperienced crew, but they were very, very good crew, and they all came up to his standard, I think. And he certainly wasn't disappointed with anyone, and he really enjoyed making the film there with them.
And what about all this location scouting? I mean, every single location, I know it's partly to do with you know, the way in which the camera looks at them, but every single location looks like if you could have found one of those. I mean, did you just know the geography of the place so well, or what?
It's a very cinematic place, Belfast. It's a wonderful town to work in cinematically. There's got some great stuff in it. Although, again, like you say, it's really Alan who and his cameraman John Ward who transformed it really.
And there is a sort of Western air to, for example, this, isn't there?
Yeah.
Walking across the great open, you know, it's a car park, but it does evoke all those kind of classic revenge dramas, the Western dramas that we know.
Yeah, and like in those, there's something impassive about life. Life looks impassively on at this great wilderness, really, in a way.
Again, very quick, very functional.
Yeah.
All the worse for it.
Yeah, and the role of cars begins to play a lot more part in it now.
So what's the significance of moving from the walk to the car? You said the car kind of takes over in the second half, and you said that the walk was important because of the walking and the marching.
Well, yeah, I can't pretend to have been aware of that at the time, but certainly looking back on it, I haven't watched it for like 10 years. I sort of felt that very strongly about the image of marching and walking, really. But the car was so present in all these killings. The getaway car being found abandoned in a particular area. A community would tell the police that the execution had been done by a certain group, you know. So it's a very important tool.
But you said that you're aware of it watching it, but do you think it was something that Alan Clarke was aware of at the time of, you know, making? I mean, did you have those kind of discussions with him about the symbolism?
No, didn't have. He wasn't interested in symbolism. He would just... In fact, I was a kind of avid Guardian symbolism type reader at the time, and he said, you don't want to read that rubbish. Read The Sun. Everything you need to know is in The Sun, he said.
Now, this is the killing that you referred to earlier. Talk us through this, because this really is...
This is an extraordinary... I remember at the time thinking how brilliant this was, and I used to love watching it when we watched the cuts, because it just kind of turned me on, really, as a young man. Now I find it, you know, having had kids and you get a bit older, I find it almost unbearable, this march up to this crawling man.
Yeah, it's the fact that he's crawling and... I mean, it's sort of turn away repugnant.
Yeah, and the other thing is the way the car, after the execution, the way the car reverses backwards now with its doors open. I was mesmerised by that. I just thought that was brilliant. I know it seems like a very tiny detail, but it's like some kind of bird coming back for them to collect its young.
But interesting that encapsulated in that scene is exactly the central tension between, on the one hand, creating something which is dramatically exciting, and yet on the other hand, creating something which is absolutely abhorrent.
Yes.
And you know, you want to look at it cinematically, but because of what you're witnessing, you actually want to turn me. This was the point, in fact, watching it just last night, as I did, that I turned away because it seemed too grim.
He would have, had he not died, I think he would have been lauded now, because he had a grip on violence and the way that it occupies men's minds, particularly, that now is very popular. Is very, you know, he would get a lot of support as a filmmaker, a lot of support. I mean, this is the second film he made about Northern Ireland. He made a film called Contact, which is about a bunch of soldiers, which he didn't make in Northern Ireland. He made, I think, in the Pennines between Leeds and Manchester, and in Wales, I think, and which is a brilliant film about a group of soldiers in Northern Ireland. He loved, technically, he loved, you know, he would call himself a technician. He wouldn't call himself an artist. And he would call himself a technician, really. And he loved technical experimenting, pushing the boundaries of what was technically possible. And this kind of wide-angle camera, really, there was very, very few people who would dare to use that kind of wide angle and what it gave to you. People regard it as ugly, whereas you were meant to try and make things look beautiful. There's an ugliness about it. Of course, we know now, looking at it, it's much more beautiful than any attempt to to manipulate the look of the film through close-ups or whatever and lighting to look good. But he was obsessed with technical experimenting.
There's something about the way in which he films spaces that I think, is reminiscent in your work, I would say, in Shallow Grave and the inside of that flat. Also, people would obviously connect a lot of this with the beginning of Train Spotting, the moving and following the characters. But he has a way of filming buildings and being inside spaces that you do seem to have taken from him.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be very happy to even get near him, really. It's... I think you have to try and make your landscape cinematic. Wherever you're making your film, you have to try and make it be a world for a cinema audience. They want to see a world portrayed, not just a room, I think. And so they want something, even if it's potentially, and to other people, ugly and uncinematic. That doesn't matter. If you can find a way of showing it to people, then it can become worthy of its place in a movie theatre, I think.
And what about the emptiness of the area? We've talked about the emptiness of the buildings, but empty streets.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole point about this is, it's, as you say, there are no witnesses.
Yeah.
These people are, how artificial is that? How much did you have to create this emptiness, and how much was it there waiting for you?
Oh no, there's lots of. I'm sure there's lots of people around, but they are erased by the filmmaker. I don't mean literally. I don't mean he's done it by CG. He's obviously done it through.
Blocked off the streets. Yeah.
He's actually just blocked off the streets, but he wanted that to feel like the witnesses had been erased. I think, because it is true, there are no witnesses. These people are never arrested. The only way they're ever traced is if the guns and forensics would find similarities between a gun found on somebody and that had been used in previous executions or whatever. There's never any question of being shopped or traded in by witnesses or informed on. And that's part of police, it was part of police life there, that they knew they would never find witnesses to it.
And what about this constant cutting between the prowling camera, the camera that is moving, that is following, that is part of the action, and the camera which is static and standing back and looking at the aftermath? I mean, that seems to me to have been very specifically orchestrated to give you two different views.
Yeah, it's the stare, which is the unremitting, unblinking stare where nothing moves, and then it's just motion, either moving towards that stare or moving away from it, really, towards that victim, that death, or away from it, really. So it's those two basic elements, really.
And how much do you think it would now be possible to make this kind of film? I mean, because its thesis is so clear and so simple and is played out absolutely over the period of time. I mean, would you be allowed to do this now? Would somebody say, no, you need to have more dialogue, you need to have character, you need to have explanation, you need to have an ending? I mean, could you do this now?
Very, very difficult now, I think, certainly in television. It's certainly possible in cinema, and Gus Van Sant has obviously used some of the techniques in his film Elephant. Mm-hmm. But I think in television terms, impossible, really. This is the most socially unconvincing. This is the last of the killings, and this I found at the time socially the most unconvincing. I said, you can't have them driving up in a Jag. They just wouldn't be using a Jag like that, Alan. And he was, and particularly when you realise what happens in it towards the end of it. But he did want to, I think what he wanted to do is he just wanted to bewilder people. And he didn't want anybody to feel that they had a key to knowing what was going to happen next. Sure. And therefore, for anybody to feel superior to it, like they could take some kind of opinion or attitude to it, he wanted to stop you having that comfort, really, because it would make you feel like you understood or felt that you could solve, because the next thing from understanding is you think then it's opinion and then you feel you can solve it. So he filmed this, and he's got... What is extraordinary, I think, there's all this light in this building and no work. It's a vast, I think it was a tobacco factory. A vast, vast area, all this light and no work. And also, I think, on a poetic level, though he would hate and he would deny this to his, I would say there's all this light and there's no clarity, which I think is the whole point about it, really. You can see everything, but it's so difficult to actually get to make any progress with it, And that's why I feel, funnily enough, the hopelessness of the work, if you like, is accurate at the time, but actually is false. And I believe that you do have to find some hope in it somewhere, because I think people do eventually, and I think they have done in Northern Ireland. They've managed to grind out, albeit only impartially so far, they've managed to grind out some progress. And that is... I think you and Alan is so honest in his work, he would now turn around and say that as well. Sure. He would say there is some chance of progress, and it has moved on a little bit. You know?
This episode is also notable as well because it's one of the very few things which has the dramatic, the surprise. I mean, you're being set up here to think that the relationship between these two characters is something, and then it actually does it sort of twists on you. It's deliberately leading you astray, as you say, with the Jag, with whatever the relationship between these two characters is
yes.
leading you astray, right?
Yes, it is, and I think that's he's showing how. It's not just a dramatic twist to make you feel satisfied, because I don't think anybody could watch a film like this and feel satisfied. But it's
deliberately wrong-footing you.
It's deliberately wrong-footing you to show, I think, how difficult it is to understand. And when you are outside the tribes, as we were, to feel that you can define them in a way that will help people. Mm-hmm. It's very, very difficult to understand this at all. Although there are cases where this kind of thing did happen, where people are obviously taken by their own side and executed, and they know it's going to happen to them, and there's something inevitable about it. And I think
what makes that so terrible is that the implication is that all the characters know what's going on. It's the audience that doesn't.
Yeah.
But to the characters in it, it's absolutely the only way it could be working.
The only way it's ever going to work.
Which is that hopelessness that you're talking about.
Yeah, which was true at the time.
So looking at it now, again, after all this time, how do you feel about it?
I was enormously proud of it last night when I watched it again. I do feel it was, you sort of feel a personal thing. It's a tribute to all these people who worked on it, who I knew them all personally. And Mark Hoffman now is a big line producer and producer with Working Title. So all sorts of people have gone on to great things, but you feel an affection for them all personally. Peter Lindsay he was doing Captain Corelli's mandolin the last I heard. Mm-hmm. But you...
Danny Boyle did all right as well.
Apparently. I've done all right as well. I know. But that's the man, really. And I think the tribute that this, putting together these films, including Elephant, is a wonderful tribute to him, that his work lasts and continues on in the way that Kieslowski's does, and that they do speak, they continue to speak to people, really, and people pull from them things that are valuable and important for their own lives.
Danny Boyle, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.